All right, well, it looks like it's 7 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our first ever BYOB book chat, coming to you virtually from all of our living rooms. I hope you have your beverage. I've got my tea handy here and my librarian mug. So here's how the night's gonna work. Myself and 6 other library staff are going to tell you about some of the books that we've read recently and enjoyed, tell you a little bit about the plot, what we liked about it. As Amy was saying a moment ago, if you've read something recently that you enjoyed, go ahead and type that in the chat. And then when we get to the end, I'll read through them and we'll share it with everybody. So our presenters tonight, let's see, are Amy, Beth, Brenna, that's me, Chris, Denisa, Josh, and Katie. I should also mention every book that we're going to talk about tonight is available digitally. So that will either be through OVERDRIVE, HOOPLA, or Access 360. If you've never used those before, you can go ahead and find out some more information on our website. So I'm up first, and I'm going to tell you about The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers by Maxwell King. This was one of my favorite books that I read last year. It's a memoir of the famous Mr. Rogers. If you're looking for just kind of a feel-good memoir, I think this is really good for that. It goes through his entire life. So from the time when he was a kid and he was kind of overweight and he was bullied, and it talks about how that really influenced his career and his work with children. And it talks about how he was really one of the first people in television and in children's entertainment specifically. I found really interesting that everything that he did was intentional. So like every single puppet that you saw on the show and every single storyline, there was a lot of academic research and a lot of thought behind all of that. So if you're looking for something that just kind of makes you feel good, I don't think you have to be a huge fan of Mr. Rogers. All of us probably encountered him either when we were kids or maybe your kids watched the show. But I think it's really kind of an uplifting, fun read. You get to learn about someone really interesting. So that is The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers by Maxwell King. That is available on HOOPLA.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy. I work in the adult department. I read this one on a trip recently, 9 Perfect Strangers by Liane Moriarty, and I read it because I really liked, what's that other one that got made into a miniseries?
Big Little Lies.
Big Little Lies. I liked that one. I listened to it, and then I loved the miniseries. And it's rare that I think that the movie or the TV show is better than the book, but in this case, I really thought it was. And so I decided to give another one of Liane Moriarty's books a try. And this one is about, it takes place in Australia like the other one. And I think she's an Australian author, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So the main character in this book goes to a wellness retreat, and she has had some crazy things happen to her and she wants to lose a little bit of weight. And so she goes to this super new agey wellness retreat with 8 other perfect strangers, and there's some hijinks involved, and it gets really dark kind of in the middle. And I liked it because it was a page turner. It was super easy to read. It was a really good one for like, if you want to put it down and then come back to it sometime later. Like I think I started it in December and then I kind of forgot about it. And then I wanted to read a book really quickly. And I was like, oh, I'll just read the rest of this one. And so that's what I did. I couldn't help but think as I was reading it that it would make a really, really good TV show or movie. And I think I read recently that it's being made into a TV show now, but I was thinking about like who would play each part. And I think for the role of Masha, Brennan, did you read this one?
Not yet, but I want to.
Not yet. Okay. So tell me what you think when you do read it, because I was like, oh my gosh, Masha has got to be played by Mae Musk, Elon Musk's mother. And I kept picturing it as a movie. And so I'm really excited for if this one gets turned into a movie.
Awesome.
That's all I got.
Okay, this one's mine. My name's Beth, also work in the adult department of the library. This one, My Beloved World, is about Sonia Sotomayor, who is a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. I have a tendency to read nonfiction as opposed to fiction, and I was just astounded at this book. When you read it, and she starts, you know, from very young age, and really, I think, does an excellent job of describing how she grew up, the environment she grew up, both the geographical, physical environment, as well as her internal family environment. Her mother and father both immigrated individually from Puerto Rico, moved to the States, met each other when they were living in the States, and then she was born in the States, in the Bronx area of New York. Her father had a third-grade education. He never spoke any English. He was an alcoholic. He died when she was, I think, 8. Her mother was described as emotionally distant, but put a great deal of emphasis on education in the home. They were very poor growing up. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was, I think, 8. And her mother just simply could not deal with needles. So she had to, at age 8, had to start giving herself her insulin injections every single day and monitoring her own health. I think it just does a really, really wonderful job of giving you this window into, at least for me, a very different world, both in terms, again, in terms of geography, you know, New York, the Bronx in New York, the poor areas of New York, as well as her culture. Her family went back to Puerto Rico almost every summer. She was very, very close to that side of the family. And then just how she rose academically through great struggle and incredible self-determination to become a US Supreme Court Justice. And I just found it absolutely fascinating.
All right, so this is mine, A Princess in Theory. This is your traditional romance book, so if you like romance, check this one out. I read it because it's written by a Black woman, and there are not very many romances written by diverse voices, so I wanted to give attention where attention was needed, and I actually really liked this book. This is about a character named Letty, and she is studying to be an epidemiologist, and she is so busy, and she works like 4 jobs, and she keeps getting emails from a prince who claim that she is his betrothed, and he wants to make a connection with her again, and she thinks they're scam, but they're not scam. And Prince Tabizo is actually trying to get in touch with her because they're from the same fictional African kingdom, and things happen. And it's about a female scientist, which I also think there needs to be more of. And this was actually just really smart and really well written.
When is it set?
It is set in current day in New York City.
Awesome. I'm up next. My next book is How to Walk Away by Catherine Center. I recently started reading her books and I'm becoming obsessed. I think she's just so wonderful. This is contemporary fiction. It's got a hint of romance. It's not the center of the story, but if you like a little bit of that, it might interest you. So basically the story is Margaret is in her mid-20s. She's got everything going perfect for her. She's about to accept her dream job. She just got engaged. And then she's in this terrible plane accident and her whole life is turned upside down. So from her physical recovery to kind of the family things that start happening, her long lost sister comes back into her life. She realizes her fiance, maybe it's not gonna work out with him. It does deal with some heavy kind of stuff, but I'm not gonna give away any spoilers, but at the end of the book, you leave with like a nice, happy feeling. It's got that kind of romance vibe. But if you like reading books about family relationships, a lot of character development, characters that you really want to root for, and if you just want some escapism and to read a nice, happy story, I recommend this one. It's How to Walk Away by Catherine Center.
Unmute myself, okay. Yeah, this is a contemporary book set in London, and it's about it was, for one thing, it was the top of the library reads list, if you've heard of that, in February, and it begins with Julian, who's an elderly man who was a well-known artist back in the 60s, and he's starts a journal he calls the Authenticity Project, and writes in it about his mistakes and his loneliness since his wife passed away. And then he leaves it in his local cafe and writes a challenge in it for people to add to the journal about their secret truths and pass it on to somebody else. And so it begins this interesting journey of, first of all, Monica, who owns the cafe, picks it up, and she is struggling to run this cafe. She's a former lawyer and is secretly, desperately wishing at this point to have a family and have children. And she writes about that and then leaves it somewhere, and a young man picks it up and takes it to Thailand with him. He's trying to get himself sober, and he decides he's going to try to help Monica find her a husband in Thailand and send him to her. So anyway, this journal passes around between these people, and they become more linked together. It was compared to the movie Love Actually, if you remember that. And because it has many, many connected characters, and there's a lot of romance in it, as well as kind of charming characters. It's very funny at times. Does deal with some difficult issues that the different people are experiencing, but they become kind of a community that supports one another. And so it's uplifting, and it does have romance in it. So.
I actually picked that one up from the library before it closed, so I'm probably going to read it this week. I'm excited.
Oh, you haven't read it yet. You didn't read it yet?
Not yet, no.
Oh, okay.
I think this is Josh.
There we go, yeah. I was going to start talking, then I should unmute. So this is An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir. This is a young adult literature. Came out a couple years ago. It is the first book in a series. And the official setting is kind of in the past with some magical realism. Tahir goes and uses the Roman Empire structure, which typically is the domain of white European men, and she is neither. So that's one reason why I really like her, because she's doing something that I love. And she lands in, it's called the Martial Empire. And there's a lot of different themes. I think that this is where fantasy does one of its best jobs of taking what we're experiencing now, putting it in a slightly different context, and playing with some of the themes and some of the experiences. So we've got, a heavy militaristic organized system that's, some people would say, is oppressive, and some people would say brings freedom and safety. We have the underclass of people who are divided into, we just do as, we try to make the best of things without getting in the way of people, as well as having factions of, we need to fight fire with fire. So it brings up a lot of ethical questions about if you were on the top, quote unquote, and you were made known of a lot of the experiences of the rest of the world, or in this empire, how much responsibility do you have to take charge and to try to change something? Likewise, if you are in kind of the section that's extremely oppressed, do you take the way the peacemaker and you just try to make it the best for everyone, or do you take more of an aggressive stance against that? And so it follows two characters, and it's a person point of view chapter interchange. We follow one character who is the part of the lower class who ends up getting involved in some espionage. She starts working for an underground shadow group to infiltrate a barracks, kind of the hierarchy, so that she can connect with some of her family that's been removed from the area. We also have someone who's born in the empire. We have race relations. We have some magical abilities versus non-magical abilities. But he essentially realizes that his perfect view of the empire or the Marshall Empire is wrong. He doesn't, he's, you know, it's a young adult, so you're hitting kind of that teenage. How much good can a teenager do? And how do you play the long game in changing something from the inside out, if that's even possible? There we go.
Hi, my name is Denisa, and I'm going to talk about the book I Can See in the Dark by Karin Fossum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. I wasn't sure. This unmuting process. So Karin Fossum was recommended to me by a library patron. He was looking for some of her books, and I am not a big romance person. For like the time when I want to read something easy, I rather pick a thriller or good detective story. This book surprised me because we know nearly from the beginning who was the murderer, and the book is more about the psychological profile of the guy who killed. He's a half of the book is told from his perspective, or most of the book. Towards the end, the other characters of the book unveil their own view on the main character, and he's someone who doesn't respect rules at all. He works at the retirement house. He secretly tortures old people who are there and who are pretty much powerless against him. In the end, he ends up in the prison for the crime that he didn't commit, only to be actually discovered for the real crime after he spent some time in the prison for something he didn't do. She's an interesting author. I am definitely going to look for more of her books because it's just something completely different. It's not a typical detective story. It's not the typical crime. She is nicknamed Queen of Norwegian Crime. So, and I like her style. I like the way how it's written. It's something completely different that I have ever read from the genre. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you. All right, this is me again. This is The Lager Queen of Minnesota by J. Ryan Stradle. And he is just one of my favorite authors. All of his books are set in Minnesota, and it has just a very quintessentially Midwestern feel. A lot of the characters, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of my Aunt Debbie, or like so many other people that I know. I think he captures the spirit of the Midwest very well. So the storyline here is there are two sisters, and they have this terrible fight when they're in their 20s, and they just don't talk anymore. One of the sisters goes on and founds a really successful brewery, and the other sister does kind of the domestic route. She gets married, she has kids, and one of her grandkids ends up starting her own brewery. So their lives kind of intersect because of that. It is told across several generations, and it jumps around between the different characters, if you like that kind of thing. I don't think you need to know a lot about beer to enjoy this book. I talked to a lot of people who don't like beer at all, and they still really enjoyed it. So if you like strong women, there's a lot of really strong female characters here, a lot of character development. And once again, if you like that kind of Midwestern feel, I'd recommend this one. It's The Lager Queen of Minnesota by J. Ryan Stradle.
Brenna, I read one of his other books. I read
Kitchens of the Great Midwest.
Yeah, and it was so cute. I loved it so much. So this one's definitely going on my to-be-read list.
I love that one too. Our boss Susan recommended the first one to me, and that's how I got hooked
I
on it.
recommended it to her, and she said it sounded like a book that she didn't want to read.
I also have read that book, and it's really good. And I totally agree with Brenna about how you just recognize the characters as people in your own lives. Yeah. They're spot on with the whole Midwestern vibe.
Okay. So this one is mine. Again, another nonfiction. Emmeline Pankhurst was the woman who she was born in England in the late 1800s, and she started up the suffragette movement different than the suffragette. So ETTE versus IST. And the reason there's a difference is because the first movement, IST, they did not believe in really confrontation. They tried to work more within the system. Emmeline came along. She was born into a politically active family. She married her husband, who is significantly older than her, but he was politically active, very much went against the grain, which is why his wife could, be extremely politically active in the suffragette movement with his full support. They had 5 children. 3 of her daughters, at least initially, joined the movement as they started to get older. But the real difference with her is that she was a militant, and she tried to sort of quote unquote play by the rules and saw that that was getting them nowhere. There was a couple of times when the politicians at the point kind of said to her, oh yes, yes, don't worry, we'll do it, we'll do it. And so she backed off. And then of course, when they didn't, she's like, fine, forget it. We're doing this, and we're doing this militantly. And the women started to get arrested. They started to do hunger strikes in jail. They started, the jailers started force feeding the women. And what's interesting to me about this book, it's not an easy book to read because she writes it. And she writes it in, late 1800, early 1900 style. She will write out 4 pages of her speech that she gave in, the chamber. And so you have to read 4 pages of her speech. So I did find myself, especially towards the end, starting to skim things a little bit. So you do have to kind of be willing to give it a little leeway. But what I think was so profound about this book was it gave you an absolute firsthand account of the literal fight that these women put up and had to do in order to get women the vote. And the real physical hardships, the sacrifices, the literal danger to their lives that they were willing to take on so that women could get the vote. And unfortunately, Emmeline died less than a month before England finally gave women the vote on the same par with men. During World War I, she stopped kind of her actions because she thought it was more important to support the war. But once the war was over, she went back in again. And again, I think people think that women got the right to vote. The suffragette, it was a lot of, marching and protesting, but I don't necessarily know that they really understand the physical danger and the strategy and the long-term sacrifices that not just women, and not just women from all classes, but women and their families and certain men at the time, really the sacrifices that they had to make so that women could have the right to vote. And I just think it's a very important story for especially young women to understand. It wasn't easy, and we shouldn't ever let that backslide. And I just, again, you have to give this book a little bit of tolerance because it is written in her hand in an old-fashioned style. But I just think it's a really important story for people to really know.
Ooh, girl power.
And it looks like there's a movie coming from it, maybe?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
There have been other movies made, but those movies, at least here in America, were from the American suffragette movement. She was British, and this is absolutely the British suffragette movement. So there is a slight difference. There was a little communication between the two. At one time, she did actually go to America to do some fundraising for the British movement. But the movies, Josh, to your point, the movies that have come out, I think have portrayed more of the American suffragette movement.
Okay, so this one is My Dark Vanessa. Show of hands, who's read it? I know Brenna did. Anybody else? No? It's so dark. It's like a modern retelling of Lolita. And so Vanessa goes to this, Liz says, I have it, but haven't read it yet. Oh my God, read it next. I am a sucker for a good story. I'm a sucker for something that pulls me in. And this one, I read it in a day because I literally could not put it down. So Vanessa goes to a New England prep school and she has an affair with a teacher. She's like 14 or 15. And it really toes the line. I mean, reading it with the benefit of like age and wisdom and hindsight, it is absolutely illegal. It's statutory rape. She was being gaslit, but I think that this book puts it in the perspective of a teenage mind, and it shows you that like this is a really psychological just manipulation, and in some ways maybe even torture that she went through. And she goes back and forth between wondering if it was a consensual relationship or if it was something that happened to her. And it's my understanding that the author went to a New England prep school, and I think that before the book even begins, there's a disclaimer that this is all fiction and, don't draw any conclusions from it. But I've heard from a few people that they're aware of stories like this happening at their New England prep schools. I have some family who went to some prep schools in the same area, and they, have told me that this is not, it's not unheard of. There are rumors of something like this happening. And so she spends her entire life trying to figure out if it was a consensual relationship or if it was something that happened to her. And it's just, I think it's probably going to be an award winner. Do you agree, Brenna? I think the way that it's written, it just really draws you in, and the language is really interesting, and there's a lot of like literary parallels and references and things like that. And I think that this is one to watch.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed it. And as you're saying, it's super heavy, so it's not an easy book to read. But I also like that it wasn't just tied up in a neat little bow, like, oh, she got over it and it was fine. Like it really emphasizes the trauma of something like that and what it can do to you.
Yeah, it really makes you think too. And it just, for me, I was like, oh my gosh, how many times has this happened? Having recently been through this movement of people speaking up against their abusers and, especially powerful men, it makes you wonder how many other people are out there hiding in the shadows.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, this is one that I read. This is called All the Ways We Said Goodbye, and it was unique to anything that I had ever read because it's 3 different authors writing together. They're collaborating. It's Beatrix Williams, Lauren Willig, and Karen White. Lauren Willig does the Pink Carnations. It's kind of a spy series set in Napoleonic times. Beatrice Williams also does historical fiction set in sort of unique time periods and places. I think the recent one was, I think it's called The Golden Hour, and was about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in the Bahamas in the early 1940 or something like that. So anyway, this one is, it's set in 3 different time periods, and each of the authors does the characters in the different time period, and they alternate back and forth between them. And they're all connected kind of like by generations. So it's a little challenging to keep it straight, but the first time period is 1914 in World War I, during World War I, and that's part is around an heiress of an estate in northern France that is some sort of symbol of freedom or something in its ancestry. And but her mother is living at the Paris Ritz Hotel. So all these stories kind of circulate around the Ritz Hotel in Paris. And the second part is in 1942, and it's around a woman who becomes an operative, undercover operative. But she's also a mother, has children, is married to a man who's collaborating with the Germans. So some of it is kind of tense and spy stuff, espionage. And the third period is in 1964, and it's about a woman who is her husband is dead, and she goes to Paris to try to figure out what happened to him during World War II that kind of changed him completely, and he never really explained. So she goes there. It was beautifully written. They're all wonderful writers, and each time period has kind of a lovely romance in it. Well done. And moving. So yeah, it was really good. I would say it was ultimately uplifting. It's a little difficult, you know, some of the circumstances, but it was uplifting. And if you like historical sagas and a little dash of romance, you will enjoy this. That's it.
All right, this is me again. So this is one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. It's getting a lot of attention. It's When We Were Vikings by Andrew David MacDonald. And what I loved about this is that the main character is just so memorable. Her name is Zelda, and she is, I think, like in her early 20s, and she's born with fetal alcohol syndrome. So since she has this cognitive disability, she kind of sees the world a little differently. She's really into lists and routines, and she is obsessed with Vikings. Like, Vikings are her thing. Everything is about Vikings. But she has a really normal life. She's got a steady boyfriend. She's got friends. She gets a job at the library, and she lives with her older brother, Gert. And in the beginning, she loves her brother. He's her role model. She thinks that he's just perfect. And as the story goes on, you start to realize, okay, maybe Gert isn't so great. He's involved in the local drug deals. But what's so interesting is that it's written from Zelda's perspective. So it takes her like a little while to really realize what's going on. But it's very redemptive. It's like her claiming her own life and finding her own path and finding out what's best for her. So if you like, once again, strong female characters, it's really well written. It's fast paced. You could read it super quick. Really unique story. If you read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, it has very similar vibe to that. But I really enjoyed it. It's When We Were Vikings by Andrew David MacDonald.
Okay, this one is me again. This book is very emotional. It was very emotional to me. It says a novel. It definitely is not a traditional novel. Ocean Vuong is a poet, and it shows. I am not into poetry, but I love books that are written, if I can say, poetically. I don't know how to say it, but it's he jumps in time, he jumps in places. Every single word he uses has meaning. He is writing the book as a letter to his mom, knowing that his mom will never be able to read the book because his mom cannot speak English and cannot read even. And that was somehow the story of their lives after they came to the US, and the life became very difficult. And he was trying to be loved, and he was not getting the love he wanted, but he at the same time understood how hard everything was for his mom. And he has so much love for her. She has loads of love for him, and there are two people who cannot word that love, who cannot physically act that love of mother and son. There is loads of hurt. He's an immigrant. He is a gay. So this book is super raw, and I have goosebumps just talking about it. Having been to Vietnam and reading a lot about Vietnamese American history, it's also a book about the tragedy of small nations that go through political turmoils, and how these political things can tear families apart, can absolutely destroy roots for generations, and can have very profound effect on humans who are pushed into immigration. It's a beautifully written book, but it's very raw and very heavy. but it's beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. So just taking passages, sentences, I have written down loads from this book because it's very touching, very beautiful.
Yeah, I loved it as well. The writing is just stunning.
Yeah, thank you, Brenna.
The Long Prince Quartet is by Daniel Abraham, and this is the first book. I'm going to go ahead and read a bit for you because the person who wrote this description had fun. The city-state of Seriket dominates the summer cities. Its wealth is beyond measure, its port is open to all merchants of the world, and its ruler, the Kai Seriket, commands forces to rival the gods. Commerce and trade fill the streets with 100 languages, and the coffers of the wealthy with jewels and gold. Any desire, however exotic or base, can be satisfied in its soft quarter. Blissfully ignorant of the forces that fuel their prosperity, the people live and work secure in the knowledge that their city is a bastion of progress in a harsh world. It will be a tragedy if it fell. Seriket is poised on the knife edge of a disaster. At the heart of the city's influence are the poet-sorcerer Heshai and the captive spirit, Seedless, whom he controls. For all his power, Heshai is weak, haunted by memories of shame and humiliation. A man faced with constant reminders of his responsibilities and his failures, he is the linchpin and the most vulnerable point in Seriket's greatness. So this has, if Saba Tahir's book was more, here's some fictional history with a little bit of magical realism, this flips it. This is a completely different world, but it has shadows of politics, not too much religion, economics, kind of interpersonal relationships, whether it's mentors or romance or friendships. Also has class struggles. Daniel Abraham worked on the graphic novelizations of A Song of Ice and Fire. So he kind of sits in that sprawling, rather complicated world building. And it's magnificent because he's able to do big picture down in small picture. I've read a good bit of fantasy, and the thing that sticks out to me with this are the metaphysics. We have like these monk-like characters who seem to be able to use language to capture spirits or to capture ideas. So there's a lot of question of what does our language mean? Is it purely functional, or is there some kind of realism to the rest of the world? And I listened to this. It is available audiobook on HOOPLA, and the author is great. A lot of people will actually just follow readers, just like they might follow directors or might follow actors. And there are 4 books in the quartet, obviously. So I highly recommend it for looking at both. Again, you have questions of commerce, if we look for parallels of what we're experiencing now, who would think that our daily lives, who would think that our global economy is kind of on these shaky pedestals that we're working with right now. So this is a great way to look at some of the same concepts in a completely different context. That's that.
Right.
Okay, so this is Things You Save in a Fire by Catherine Centur. Brenna talked about her other book, How to Walk Away. And I tend to clearly gravitate towards romance and contemporary fiction, especially when life in the real world is a little too heavy. And this is about Cassie, who is a female firefighter. And Cassie has recently won an award for saving a bunch of people in a school bus. And at that award ceremony, her coworkers kind of are weird and do weird things. And and then after that award ceremony, she gets a call from her mother, her estranged mother, that her mom needs her help. And so Cassie moves to Boston and has to get used to a new firehouse that is not so accepting of a female firefighter. And Cassie also has this rule that she is not allowed to fall in love with another firefighter. And I anticipate that that rule might get broken, but I'm just only a couple chapters into it, so I'm not actually sure if that's what happens, but it seems like it's highly probable. Yeah, so that's Things You Save in a Fire by Catherine Center.
I see your cat, Brenna.
Yeah, he is making a scene. Okay, this is me again. Now I'm joined by Ralph. Just a reminder, if you have a book that you want to tell us about, go ahead and enter it in the chat. We've just got a couple books left tonight. So I'm going to talk about They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. You might recognize him from Star Trek. You don't need to be a Trekkie to enjoy this book. I'm not a Star Trek person, and I loved it. This is a graphic novel. If you have never read one before, I think this is a really good place to start. It's a memoir of his whole life, but mostly his childhood. And so he and his brother and his parents were interned at a camp during World War II on US soil because of their Japanese ancestry. So it goes into kind of what it took for them to give up their entire lives and the way that his parents worked really hard to protect them and make the best out of a really crappy situation. The illustrations are really good. I think this is really good for a lot of different age groups. I'd say anywhere from middle school through adults. So if you're looking for something that you could read with your kids, this is a good option. And it does go a little bit into his later life and how he gets into acting, but the bulk of it is kind of about that period in time that a lot of people want to forget about. So you can find this one on Hoopla. It's They Called Us Enemy by George Takei.
Yeah.
Ooh, I love this one.
Yep.
Sorry, I had forgotten to unmute myself.
No problem.
Speaking of our legal system, this is another nonfiction. They just made a movie out of this. Jamie Foxx played the innocent person who was put in jail. It's Brian Stevenson is still alive, still working. He graduated law school, and then he went down, and I want to make sure I get this right. He was based, went down to Alabama. Oh, fiddlesticks. I lost my place in my notes here. Anyway, what he basically did was he went down to Alabama and he started up something called the Equal Justice Initiative. Originally, he was working in a nonprofit who was funded by the government, and their job was to defend death row prisoners. But it was funded by the government, and lo and behold, funding stopped. And so he started up his own legal firm called the Equal Justice Initiative so that he could continue his work representing people who he believed were unfairly put on death row because they were innocent. And so the movie and the primary storyline of the book is about Walter McMillan, who was sort of the first prisoner that he took over the case. Walter McMillan had been convicted of killing a white woman in Alabama, even though he was miles away from the crime scene at the time of the crime at a community fish fry, which meant there were dozens of people who could vouch for his innocence, but he was tossed in jail anyway. And one of the other things that was interesting was from the time he was arrested, he was immediately placed, pre-trial, immediately placed on death row, which is highly unusual even in Alabama. So the book is about that particular case, and it's about Brian Stevenson's work within that world of dealing with the injustice that does happen within our criminal legal system. The movie does the same thing. It really portrays that one particular case. This book goes into more of Brian's work. So, sorry, I don't mean to speak of him as if I know him. I don't. But it goes more into the details of the system as a whole, many of the other cases he worked on, and it spreads over probably about a 20-year time span of his work within this, and how hard it is, and how endless it is, and how you really could get beat down if you don't have a way of maintaining, one, faith in the system, and two, some kind of hope in humanity, because, you know, the cases he's up against are just horrible. You know, someone as obviously innocent as Walter McMillan being put behind bars, and Walter McMillan, he appealed his guilty verdict 4 times, each time being denied, before finally Brian Stevenson taking over the appeal, and the 5th time it was finally recognized that in fact he was innocent. So again, another nonfiction, completely into the criminal justice system, but little rays of hope here and there.
Beth, did I ever tell you that I saw him speak at a library conference one time?
No, was he?
Yeah, it was fascinating. I'd never heard of him before. And this is at Public Library Association in Indianapolis in 2014, I believe. And Public Library Association has like 8 a.m. talks every day of the conference. So you have to kind of like haul yourself out of bed, drag yourself to the conference center, make sure you've had your coffee, you know. But Brenna and I were just in Nashville a couple weeks ago for another library conference, and they did it the same way. And I found all of those talks super energizing. And so I had never heard of him, but they had chosen that year, all the speakers, the 8 a.m. speakers had done a TED Talk previously. And so they all had these really fascinating things that they were talking about, and they were really good speakers. And so I actually listened to his book because I had seen him speak, and it was just fascinating to hear him tell his own story. And he does read the book. It's so good. And I agree with you. It's one that you just have to read, because until you've read about people who are on death row, you think that they're like the scum of the earth. You think that, like, you know, they've done these horrible things and lock them up, throw away the key. And you read this book and you're like, there is so much more to the story. And it just, it makes the death penalty seem even more barbaric.
Well, and the judge in this case, the jury at his trial, at his initial trial, and I won't speak of all the things that were wrong at the trial, were unjust at the trial. But one thing in particular was the jury came back with a recommendation for a life sentence. And the judge, and in Alabama, there's a quirk in the law that allows judges to do this, and they have since changed it, but the judge changed it to a death sentence.
Oh.
And do you guys see in the chat?
Yep.
Liz said that spoke at her church last year. It's just,
Liz, was it amazing? Did you love it? I mean, did you just love listening to him tell his story? Amazing, she says.
Yep.
She says amazing. Yeah.
There's one very quickly, because I know we have a couple more books to get to, but there's just one thing at the very end, because Brian Stevenson is Black, and I think it's fairly fair for me to say that many of the innocent people on death row, not all, but many of the innocent people on death row are Black, are African American. And at towards the end of the book, Mr. Stevenson is sitting on the porch of, you know, a couple of the older women, maybe his grandma, maybe his auntie, I can't remember, you know, and he's just, you know, he's lost an appeal where one of his clients has been executed, and he's just feeling drained. And he went, and he's on the porch, and he says to these 2 old women, okay, now these are 2 women born and raised in Alabama, pre-Jim Crow, you know, I mean, under Jim Crow, and they're now, you know, elderly women who've come up through the years, the decades, and he's sitting on their porch, and he's just, you know, he's like, you know, just kind of venting, and they kind of say to him, you know, buddy, you think you're tired? Let us tell you about tired.
Yeah.
You know? And I think of that, what it must take to be, you know, to use their phrasing, to be tired and to yet still continue and have faith and have hope and to persevere and be a positive person. Just amazing.
It's amazing. I could never do that. I mean, like, you know, you think about it in like the lens of your own privilege, and like, of course I could never do it. I would crash. I would like die in a second. I can't handle that kind of pressure. But then you think about how they come out of it and they have interesting things to say and they've got a story to tell. And I just think that that resilience is more amazing than anything else. Liz, did you read this one? Did you love it?
Mm-hmm.
She's also talking about The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. And I really liked that one. It's really, really good. He also spent a lot of his life in prison for something that he didn't do, but just has this really optimistic perspective through the whole thing. It's amazing.
Yeah, this sounds like it'd be a good, it's like a zoom in for Michelle Alexander's work. She wrote The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration, The Age of Colorblindness.
Mm-hmm.
So it just, you know, it's doesn't necessarily surprise us that we can actually talk with good, Liz. Good.
Liz is a captive audience right now.
Right. Yep.
All right, that was actually our last book.
Nice.
So we did get a few comments in the chat. Oh, did you have something else?
I was gonna say, I was gonna do exactly what you did. Tom said something there.
Yeah, so starting at the top, Liz had said she's finishing up The Gap of Time by Jeanette Winterson, and she's about to start The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek by Kim Michelle Richardson. I've been meaning to read The Bookwoman. I read Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes, which is a very similar storyline. It's about the Packhorse librarians in Tennessee. So I wanted to read Bookwoman and compare them. Thomas says he also sped through My Dark Vanessa, creepily fascinating. He recommends The Altruist by Andrew Ridker. It's the story of a dysfunctional family set partly in St. Louis, touches on social issues such as gay rights, cancer, infidelity, and minimalism. That looks awesome.
You know, I think that there could actually be like a sticker that just says dysfunctional family, and that like that would be super
I'll read all of
popular.
them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like my
Actually,
genre.
yep.
That and like trash is my genre.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, well, that is all we've got for the evening. Thank you to
question before we go. Has anybody read Untamed by Glennon Doyle, and do I need to read it?
I haven't read it.
Honestly, I don't want to talk bad about a book because I try to be positive. And I loved her other book, Love Warrior, which is why I read this one. But I DNF'd Untamed because it felt like a lot of kind of obvious advice, and it's also a lot about parenting, so it wasn't very applicable to me.
I feel that way about Rachel Hollis, which is why I was asking, because I'm trying to prioritize my overdrive holds. That one needs to be sacrificed. I might just do that.
Attendees, if we did this again, would you come?
Oh,
nice.
Uh-oh.
That was the cat.
Nothing to do with the wine. Amy, are you asking our attendees?
I'm asking our attendees if we did this again, if they would come.
And if they'll tell their friends to come too.
Liz says
Liz,
yes.
tell your friends.
Tell your friends. I just
Cool.
unfortunately realized that I do not read popular books because my original books weren't available in ebook format, which was kind of disappointing for me because I read some interesting books. So, yeah.
I don't think that doesn't mean that they're not popular. It just means that they're not
popular.
I tend to run into that problem a lot too because I read a lot of nonfiction, and because I get my book recommendations by reading this article in Foreign Policy Magazine or reading that article in here or there or the other places, that when I then go online to try and find them as ebooks, they're just not there.
And then best I realized, because I picked my books because I tend to read indie books, like books that, so that's part of the problem probably too.
Well, I will tell you that I just placed an order at the bookstore in Glen Ellen for 6 jigsaw puzzles. Brenna, I'm turning to you. And they delivered them. I ordered them yesterday and they delivered them today to my door. So
That's
If you can't
amazing.
find something as an ebook, check the bookstore. They're getting new stuff in every day. And Shannon is on our library board, and she's a great supporter, and we've got a great relationship with them.
And Bess, I have I pick a nonfiction book because I pick a few books before the library closed, and it's about the beginning of the Second War, the Munich Pact, the France, Germany, England, and who was the last person signing it? So when they sacrificed my country to Hitler. So I'm gonna tell you if it's worth of reading. Maybe you would like that one.
Yeah, spread that out.
Yeah.
I rely on, which does not help us right at the moment, but when we're back in capacity mode, I rely on our Swan holds list, because I put the books on hold and they come from all over the system. And so I eventually find everything I want. It's just not necessarily an e-resource.
E-format,
Yeah.
Yeah. I also tend to read loads of books written by people who are not American, by foreigners, which is probably part of the problem too. Yes.
Yes. The one you were discussing called On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, that one's very popular. It's gotten a lot of
because
praise.
he's technically he's American, right? Because he came with his mom. Because the story goes back, so his grandma, his mom is a child of an American soldier and a Vietnamese farm woman, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But then the guy went back to the US and the family said, just this is not happening. And they wouldn't allow him to answer any of her letters. He married an American woman, and eventually she managed to come to the US and brought the daughter and her son with her. And then he actually found his way. So they had a nice relationship with his American grandpa. But it's not written clearly, it's not like your typical novel that it just jumps back and forth, and you are picking all these bits and pieces of the glass and putting the whole picture together while you are reading the book. But it's beautiful. Yeah, it's about how it's written. Yeah, more than I have read many stories, similar stories to this one, but it's just the way how he the emotions he was going through, and the way how he wrote the book, I guess, made it so special.
Right.
Nisa, I remember when you were reading that book, because every time I saw you in the library, you would talk to me about it. So
I really loved it. Yeah.
I can tell.
When poets write fiction, they use such beautiful language. When a poet writes fiction,
it's
They're
different.
very intentional with their word choices.
They are, and they can, it's beautiful.